I don't mean to be dramatic, but Vaporwave is dead as dirt. I'm not the first person to say that. In fact, it's so often said on the internet that the phrase Vaporwave is dead has become a bit of a meme in and of itself. Now, Vaporwave has died for a lot of reasons. I'll go into examples of some of those reasons later in this video. That said, I think Vaporwave can be revived from the dead, if done correctly. Some fairly recent video games have proven that, with the right mindset and the right effort, Vaporwave can be really, really cool. So let's begin this from the beginning. What is Vaporwave, and why did it die? At its most stripped down, Vaporwave is an art movement that remixes consumer culture at the late 80s and 90s and to give it an ethereal, perhaps somewhat dreamlike flavor. In fact, if you were being somewhat lazy, you could argue that Vaporwave repurposes aspects of aesthetics popular in the 90s in the same way that Synthwave repurposes aesthetics popular in the 80s. Now, on the musical front, Vaporwave is often associated with slowed down, late 80s and 90s music that has been remixed to give it a distant, hollow, and somewhat dreamy vibe. For instance, if I was going to lazily make my own Vaporwave music, all I'd really need to do is find some pop music or smooth jazz from the 80s or 90s, slow it way down, lower the quality, add some beats to it, and maybe add some reverb. Of course, I might be discounting the effort put into good Vaporwave a bit too much. When done well, Vaporwave music is simultaneously relaxing, but perhaps a little unsettling, and dreamlike. Shoving my head firmly up my backside for a moment, the best way I can describe Vaporwave music is the feeling you get when you step outside of a loud party full of people and alone with your own thoughts outdoors. That unique feeling of calmness, emptiness, and a little bit of loneliness. The visuals of Vaporwave are also firmly rooted in nostalgia, though they tend to focus more on glitchiness than hollowness. The usual vibe is one combining 80s and 90s commercials, videos of malls, Japanese anime and words, and pop culture content with images of pink and blue, checkerboard patterns, Greek busts, palm trees, and malls. In fact, a lot of Vaporwave visuals are simply VHS tape rips of commercials and home movies. Along those lines, it's not uncommon to see Vaporwave music paired with other content to give it a bit of flavor. One cool example of this application in practice is the YouTube channel This Is Dan Bell. Dan Bell's most popular content involves him wandering around abandoned malls, where he uses Vaporwave music as a backing track for visuals of blown-out mall stores and empty hallways. It's not exactly beautiful to see, but it's certainly interesting to see, and that's arguably all that matters. That said, a lot of Vaporwave art is garish, if not somewhat silly. Candidly, a lot of the elements shouldn't really work together. For instance, it's not particularly clear what Greek busts have to do with Windows 95, other than that both might have found their way into advertisements in the 90s. As another example, a lot of Vaporwave art seems to be inspired by anime and other Japanese content. While this seems inconsistent at first, this is likely a function of the fact that the same people into Vaporwave are also likely into anime, city pop, and things like that. As an aside, there's something genuinely hilarious about how bad some of the Google Translate jobs are when it comes to Vaporwave art. It's just really stupid stuff. Putting things together, the combination of Vaporwave's various visual elements, the dreamlike, slowed-down 80s and 90s music combined with the vintage, poppy, almost corporate video, is, at least in my mind, kind of intoxicating. It honestly sounds stupid, but sometimes Vaporwave music makes me want to go walk through a mall drinking Pepsi, and worrying about whether girls like me or something. All the same, I'm probably not selling the underlying vibe of Vaporwave very well. If you want a good representation of what Vaporwave is, one of my best recommendations for my more normal, non-internet friends is the Spliff radio video Neon Palm Mall, which is a combination of 90s VHS tape recordings of malls, 90s commercials, and Vaporwave music. This video, standing alone, explains Vaporwave well more than I ever could. There's just something about combining videos of teenagers in a 90s mall with dreamlike, catchy, and somewhat poppy music that just feels good. At least, to me. Of course, serious fans of Vaporwave are likely already seething because my description of the genre is, at best, extremely high level. One problem with Vaporwave is that its fans began to almost immediately subdivide it into different subgenres. For example, one aspect of Vaporwave that quickly came into prominence, even on streaming platforms like Spotify, is future funk, which is basically Vaporwave's more upbeat younger brother with a bit more Japanese influence. In fact, a lot of very prominent artists, like Young Bae, seemingly got their start making Vaporwave-adjacent music, like future funk. That said, most of the other subgenres of Vaporwave are, at best, idiosyncratic divisions of their parent category. For example, the difference between mall-soft, vapor pop, low jam Vaporwave and Vaporwave itself is minimal at best. Now, my brief allusion to the complexity of the subgenres of Vaporwave brings me to my next big topic: why Vaporwave is, at least in my opinion, dead. On one hand, and without being too simplistic, Vaporwave is polarizing, at best. Even if you never knew about it before, you probably already knew by this point in the video whether Vaporwave's your bag or not. Part of this likely has to do with nostalgia. A lot of Vaporwave's appeal relies on your nostalgia for the 90s, and in particular the consumerist American version of the 90s that was uniquely embodied by malls, pop music, and advertising. On the other hand, Vaporwave itself doesn't really lend itself to being popular. Some of its fans and creators are just obnoxious people, and that's definitely killed the scene as well. While many of the creators in the Vaporwave scene are quite relaxed and cool, an unfortunate number of them appear to be quite self-important and nitpicky, making the entire scene a bit impenetrable. If you don't believe me, take a quick gander at Reddit's r/Vaporwave, which makes you feel like the entire Vaporwave fanbase is comprised of children and neckbeards. Though, you know, that just might be Reddit. Along those lines, it's not uncommon for YouTubers to sit around debating how some slowed down 90s jazz with reverb is really a super deep analysis of consumer culture and capitalism. In my mind, this is a common problem with Vaporwave. You can't just like Vaporwave, you have to turn it into some political statement. Probably because you're an 18-year-old freshman desperately trying to convince the girl at your dorm party that you're totally deep and cool in counterculture, while she sips on a White Claw, browses Instagram, and hopes that you'll just give her an edible and leave her alone. On the other hand, the Vaporwave scene is jam-packed with lazy Vaporwave artists, who do little more than fart out slowed-down 90s music and call themselves professional musicians. It's like the nerdier version of being a SoundCloud rapper, honestly. 0% effort, 100% expectations. Seemingly aware of this toxic community, it's not uncommon for some in the Vaporwave community to try to wield irony like a sword. In fact, a surprising number of people in the Vaporwave community intentionally put out trashy, self-parodying work product to make some sort of ill-defined statement. In other words, they don't even try to put out good Vaporwave content anymore, they just fart out nonsense and pretend like it's meant to be bad, and that you're missing the point if you don't like it. Candidly, this approach to art always irritates me. It's the edgelord version of art. If you're gonna try to be artistic, just stick your neck out and own your work product, even if people ultimately don't like it. Putting out trash to parody yourself is just an excuse to build a layer of abstraction between yourself and your artistic output, and it's a lame form of self-protection that should be left in high school. In any event, Vaporwave is, at least in my opinion, dead. It's hard to really tell from many sources, but Google Trends indicates it's been on a strong downward spiral ever since a little after 2018. It seems that it's been reduced down to a bit of a flash-in-the-pan meme, along with other dated memes that got popular in 2016 like Harambe and Damn Daniel. Now, like I said, I think a Vaporwave could be revived. The thing is, it's going to take a lot more than yet another fresh wave of slowed-down 90s music to save it. Many other people on YouTube who are way smarter than me have already made one point, so I'll simply repeat it here. Vaporwave is more than just music. It's an art form, which includes a variety of different forms of media. Vaporwave doesn't really come into its own when shared as a bunch of random MP3 files or something like that. Rather, it's a vibe, which often best comes through in a combination of music and visuals, whether those visuals be art, video, or in an interactive form, such as in video games. In my mind, and in addition to the Neon Palm Mall video I mentioned before, The best examples of the kind of places that good Vaporwave can go are two video games, Broken Reality and Hypnospace Outlaw. I know that's a bit confusing, so please bear with me. Let me explain these games, and I'll get back to why they're examples of the kind of art that might revive Vaporwave. Let's start with Broken Reality. Now, on the surface, Broken Reality is a pretty straightforward game. It is a first-person Metroidvania with no enemies, effectively making it a Metroidvania walking simulator where you collect likes and try to get through various hyper-stylized levels. That's a little bit unique, but barely so. The thing is, where Broken Reality succeeds is in the vibes. It's clearly jam-packed, full of inspiration from Vaporwave-like places, but it actually utilizes this inspiration for good effect. The malls aren't just ideas, they're real 3D environments you can explore and engage with. Concepts explored in Vaporwave art, such as the idea of 90s and 2000s computer imagery, are used to form an environment you can actually interact with. For example, the idea of critiquing capitalism isn't just reflected in assumptions about the underlying music playing in the background, but instead it's portrayed in much more direct ways. Part of the game involves using a credit card to spend recklessly, and the vast majority of faceless NPCs in the game are shown ignoring you and engaging with their smartphones. Moreover, the Vaporwave music accentuates the tone of the gameplay, giving the entire game an ethereal, nostalgic, and somewhat surreal vibe. It's not cloying or in your face, but instead works perfectly as a mood-setting music for the game. Perhaps more importantly, the game is just fun. You can kick it on, lean back, and relax and explore the environment. It doesn't surprise you with crappy out-of-nowhere enemies like the otherwise great games such as Observer. You get all of the time you want to chill, enjoy the environments in the game, and take in all the vibes. The Vaporwave is merely a spice added to an already tasty meal. What Broken Reality proves, at least to me, is that Vaporwave is, at least at its heart, really cool when done correctly. That is, there's definitely opportunity for Vaporwave 2, when done really well, really knock it out of the park. Another example of Vaporwave-like concepts done well that I'd highly recommend is the game Hypnospace Outlaw. It's a massive love letter to the late 90s and early 2000s GeoCities websites. While nostalgic about a time and a place that's a bit later in history than the usual Vaporwave content, it nonetheless is a masterclass in how you leverage nostalgia into something bigger than the sum of its parts. In Hypnospace Outlaw, your job is to browse what is essentially pretend GeoCities and basically play a filthy Janny that prevents people from having fun and saying naughty things online. You are, accordingly, almost without question, the bad guy, as all Jannies are. The thing is, Hypnospace Outlaw is thankfully way more than a virtual Janny simulator. Without spoiling key plot elements, Hypnospace Outlaw has a lot to say, albeit implicitly, about being a teenager, growing up in the early era of the internet, the awkwardness of personal relationships, and things like that. In other words, what Hypnospace Outlaw does is laser target the feeling of being a preteen or teenager right at when the internet began to come into the family homes, at a time when many of us had silly little GeoCities websites where we would interact with strangers online and talk about our interests and problems. That said, it doesn't just try to make you remember the past. It uses the past as a launching pad for telling a bigger story and exploring bigger themes. I'm not even remotely pulling punches here. Hypnospace Outlaw has more of a story in one fake GeoCities page than most AAA games have in their entire game. If you haven't played Hypnospace Outlaw, you really need to, ideally ASAP. But back to my original topic discussion. Hypnospace Outlaw is another great example of how Vaporwave-like concepts can be leveraged into something more than just slowed down 90s music in malls. Hypnospace Outlaw reappropriates aspects of late 90s, early 2000s culture, but more than just a weak member-berry sort of thing. What it does is use those nostalgic elements as a tool to be funny, to be sad, and to be surprisingly dramatic, all from the comfort of a fake Janny web browser. This shouldn't surprise you too much. The idea of using a period of time as a sort of nostalgic backdrop for bigger themes is common in most media. To sum things up, I think that Vaporwave can be revived, and we're seeing proof of how it might be revived in games like Broken Reality and Hypnospace Outlaw. As you can probably glean from my earlier discussion, in my opinion, Vaporwave is bogged down with self-important fans, lazy creators, and an overall lack of improvement. Vaporwave often feels, to me at least, like it is little more than music made by neckbeards, the kind who took one music class and one political science class in college and decided that they were completely equipped to turn slowed down 90s music into political statements. That said, some fairly good music and YouTube videos came out of that world, but the Vaporwave scene is nonetheless seeming to slowly begin to lose steam. It seems a little silly to say this, but reviving Vaporwave from the dead is going to require genuine talent, not slavish adherence to an aesthetic. Vaporwave is a fun tool that can be used to elevate otherwise good work, but that means it needs to be paired with genuinely good work, not just used as a blueprint for what people believe Vaporwave should be. Good games, like Broken Reality, can dive into Vaporwave-like concepts and transform them into something genuinely fun and interesting, albeit portrayed through a Vaporwave lens. So with all that said, if you're just a random dude on the internet, what can you do? All I ask is that you keep an open mind. I know a lot of Vaporwave is dumb, reductive nonsense, but if you write off the entire scene, you're gonna miss genuine masterpieces, like Hypnospace Outlaw. Thank you very much for watching this video. I look forward to your feedback in the comments.